The coffee in Petty Officer Evans' mug jittered, dancing to the deep, resonant thrum of the USS Nevada's generators. It was 07:53, Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Moored just off Ford Island, the Nevada was at the end of Battleship Row, a picture of serene, peacetime power. Evans was on deck, enjoying the warm Hawaiian air, idly watching the flag being prepared for morning colors. Then the thrum changed. It was joined by a new sound, a high-pitched, angry whine that didn't belong. He looked up, annoyed, expecting a hot-dogging Army pilot from Wheeler Field. He saw the planes, a lot of them, banking hard over the harbor. He saw the red meatballs on the wings. It wasn't a drill. A sudden, terrible clarity descended. He sprinted for his station, an open-air, .50 caliber machine gun mount, one of the ship's paltry anti-aircraft defenses. He fumbled with the charging handle as the first explosions rocked the harbor. Across the water, the USS Arizona lifted out of the sea, consumed by a volcanic bright orange fireball that vaporized 1,000 men. A torpedo, then another, slammed into the Oklahoma. Evans grabbed the grips of his .50 cal and fired, the thump-thump-thump feeling pathetically small. The sky was full of torpedo bombers and dive bombers, moving with contemptuous ease, as if swatting at flies. The Nevada took a torpedo in her bow. Then the dive bombers came. One bomb, then two, then a cascade. Burning, gushing smoke. The Nevada was the only battleship to get underway. Her captain beached her hard at Hospital Point to avoid blocking the channel. Evans, covered in soot and oil, his gun's barrel warped from useless firing, stared back at the apocalypse. The belief that battleships were the invulnerable kings of the sea had died in 90 minutes. The air was the new battlefield, and the American dreadnought was a sitting duck. The intruder was not just the plane, but the brutal, undeniable fact that the floating fortress was a myth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The shockwave from Pearl Harbor rolled back across the Pacific, slamming into the offices of the Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C. It was followed 2 days later by an even more terrifying aftershock. On December 10, 1941, off the coast of Malaya, the Royal Navy's new fast battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse were at sea. They were modern, powerful, and hunting the Japanese, but they had no air cover. A force of Japanese Betty and Nell bombers found them. In less than 80 minutes, both capital ships were on the bottom of the South China Sea, sunk purely by aircraft. In Washington, naval architects and admirals stared at the reports with a chilling realization. The mystery was not if the battleship was obsolete, but how it had become obsolete so fast. The problem was a fundamental gap between perception and reality. The Navy had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of a gun duel that would never be fought. The Japanese, meanwhile, had perfected the art of naval aviation. The battleship, with its 14-inch guns and 15-inch thick armor belts, was designed to fight other battleships. It was completely, almost criminally, unprepared to fight a 2-ton aircraft. The emerging mystery was one of survival. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was now, by necessity, a carrier fleet. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were the new queens, but carriers were thin-skinned and vulnerable. They needed escorts. They needed a protective screen of anti-aircraft fire. The only ships that could provide that, and also soak up a hit, were the battleships. But the battleships themselves were vulnerable. It was a tactical paradox. The ships salvaged from the mud of Pearl Harbor, the Nevada, the California, the West Virginia, could not simply be repaired. They had to be reborn. The architects looked at the damage photos, the reports of ineffective .50 caliber fire, and the sheer number of enemy planes. The puzzle seemed impossible. How do you make a 25-year-old 27-ton ship designed for a different war, invulnerable to the sky. What they didn't know was that this mandate for survival would create the most heavily armed gun platforms the world had ever seen. The historical problem was one of mathematics, and the math was grim. In 1941, the U.S. Navy's anti-aircraft doctrine was a failure. The primary light AA weapon was the M2 50 caliber machine gun. It fired a solid bullet with an effective range of about 2,000 yards. A Japanese Kate torpedo bomber, however, could release its torpedo from that same distance, or even further. The gunners were, in effect, throwing pebbles. The medium weapon was the 1-inch 75 caliber quad mount, known as the Chicago Piano. It was a Rube Goldberg-esque contraption, water-cooled, heavy, and notoriously prone to jamming. Its 1-inch shell was too light to be effective, and the gun couldn't track fast-moving targets. The heavy AA gun was the 5-inch 25 caliber. It was a good gun, but it was hand-loaded and had a low muzzle velocity, giving it a ceiling of only 27 feet. More critically, its fire control was rudimentary. Gunnery officers were using optical rangefinders and dead reckoning to predict where a 250 meth plane would be. The fuses for the 5-inch shells were time-based, set by hand or by a mechanical setter. If the calculation was off by half a second, the shell would explode harmlessly in empty air, hundreds of feet from the target. Reports from the Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, had been warning of this gap for years. The British, who had been fighting for 2 years, were sending desperate memos. The attack on Taranto in 1940, where 21 obsolete swordfish biplanes crippled the Italian fleet, was a warning. The crippling of the Bismarck by a single swordfish torpedo was another. But the scale of the Pacific was the real issue. The U.S. fleet would have to cross thousands of miles of open ocean, constantly under threat from Japanese island air bases like Rabaul and Truk, unsinkable aircraft carriers. The fleet would be in a permanent state of air defense. Early attempts to fix the problem were futile. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 saw the loss of the carrier Lexington. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October saw the Hornet sunk and the Enterprise badly damaged. After-action reports were blunt. AA fire, while heavy, was largely ineffective in preventing coordinated attacks. The fleet was fighting a three-dimensional war with two-dimensional weapons. That data translated to human terror. For a sailor on the deck of a ship during an air defense condition read, the experience was one of complete helplessness. We are on the USS Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz, October 26, 1942. The ship is under a coordinated Kantai-Kessen strike. The sailors see the Japanese Val dive bombers peeling off from 14 Grauser feet, plunging almost vertically. The 5-inch guns bark, but the planes are too fast. As the gunners track the Vals, the Kate torpedo bombers sneak in low, scraping the wave tops, coming from the ship's bow and stern. The noise is a physical assault. It is the shriek of the 1-inch guns, the thump-thump of the Pate Guy 50 calibers, and the constant deafening whump of the 5-inchers. It is the scream of officers on the bridge. Hard a port, hard a starboard, as the ship twists violently to comb the torpedoes, to present its narrowest bow profile. But the Japanese have practiced this. The attack is a box, coming from all directions at once. A bomb hits the flight deck, then another. A Kate drops its fish, and the Hornet shudders as the torpedo rips into her machinery spaces. She is dead in the water. This was the human consequence. Men lived in helmets and flash gear for days on end, sleeping at their gun mounts, exhausted, listening to the incessant condition-red alarms. The ships themselves were suffering. The naval architects at the Bureau of Ships, BUShips, faced an impossible problem. The fleet was screaming for more guns, but every gun added weight. Every pound of weight added topside made the ship less stable. To add the for one, 1-inch guns, designers had to remove armor or other equipment. The ships were already a delicate compromise of speed, armor, and firepower. To add the necessary defenses to survive, the ships would have to be completely rebuilt. It would be faster, the experts agreed, to build new ships, turning the old, slow veterans of Pearl Harbor into effective anti-aircraft platforms. It couldn't be done. The hero of this story was not a single man. It was a system, an anonymous collective genius born from the engineering departments of the Navy and two foreign-born ideas. The first was the Oerlikon 20mm cannon. A Swiss design, its plans had been smuggled out of occupied Europe. The U.S. Navy, desperate for a replacement for the 150 caliber, reverse-engineered it and put it into mass production. It was simple, air-cooled, and fired a 20mm explosive shell that could shred the unarmored aluminum skin of a Japanese aircraft. It was the perfect last-ditch knife-fighting weapon. The second, and most important, hero was the Bofors 40mm gun. A Swedish design from the 1930s, it was simply a masterpiece. It fired a 2-pound shell at 120 rounds per minute with incredible accuracy, out to a range of 4,000 yards. The U.S. Navy had acquired a British licensed version, but it was built to metric standards, unsuitable for American mass production. In an unsung feat of engineering brilliance, Buord engineers took the metric Bofors, completely reverse-engineered it, and redesigned it for American SAE standards, all while keeping it compatible with the original ammunition. They created a quad mount, 4 guns on a single power-driven gyro-stabilized mount. That was a technological marvel. But the character that embodied this transformation was a ship, the USS Nevada, BB-36. Commissioned in 1916, she was an old warrior. She had pioneered the all-or-nothing armor scheme that became standard on all future battleships. At Pearl Harbor, she had been hit by 1 torpedo and at least 6 bombs. Salvaged from the mud, she was patched up and sent to the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, arriving in mid-1942. She was a gutted, scarred, obsolete wreck. The engineers at Puget Sound were not just tasked with repairing a ship, they were tasked with resurrecting the dead and making it invincible. The Nevada was a blank slate, a 27,000-ton steel canvas that represented the Navy's greatest failure and its only hope for a new kind of fortress. The crazy idea was born in the drafting rooms of the Puget Sound Navy Yard. The fleet's request was simple: total AA. This was not just adding a few guns, it was a complete reconstruction. A shipyard foreman looking at the initial plans would have balked. "The fleet wants 10 quad Bofors mounts?" one engineer might have said. "That's over 11 tons per mount before ammunition and directors. We bolt that much weight to the superstructure, she'll roll over in the first heavy sea." The conflict was physics versus necessity. And the secondary armament, another would add, the 5-inch 51s, they're useless for AA. They want the new 5-inch 38 dual-purpose gun. That means ripping out the old casemates, new barbettes, new electrical, new hoists. A third, more senior architect would look at the calculations. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. The center of gravity will be 1.5 feet too high. It's impossible." The idea that solved it was radical and ugly. Then we add blisters. To compensate for the massive new topside weight, 10 quad 40mm Bofors, 40 barrels, 48 20mm Oerlikons, and a completely new battery of 16 5-inch 38 guns and 8 twin turrets, they would have to make the ship wider. Engineers proposed welding massive hollow steel blisters onto the entire length of the hull. This would increase her beam from 108 feet to 114 feet, giving her the stability she needed to carry her new arsenal. This was the first conflict, and the decision was made. The Nevada and her salvaged sisters, West Virginia and California, would be sacrificed as a battleship in the traditional sense. She would lose speed. The blisters added so much drag that she would be slower than ever, too slow to keep up with the new Iowa-class ships or the Essex-class carriers. She would never fight a gun duel. Instead, she would be reborn as a new class of vessel, something the Navy had never seen. A dedicated fire support and AA platform. She was being designed specifically to walk into a storm of enemy aircraft and survive. The rebuild was approved. The Puget Sound Navy Yard in 1943 was a symphony of industrial power. The Nevada sat in dry dock, unrecognizable. Her old, elegant cage masts had been cut away. Her entire superstructure was gone. In its place, shipyard workers, men and women, Rosie the riveters, were welding a new solid armored tower. This tower would house the brains of the fortress, the new MK-37 gun directors, equipped with radar. The air was filled with the smell of welding flux and the blue-white glare of arc welders. Thousands of new electrical cables were snaked through the ship. Deep in her hull, below the waterline, sailors were installing the newest innovation. The Combat Information Center, CIC. This was a dark, cramped room where radar, radio, and spotting data was plotted in real time. It was the ship's new nervous system. On deck, the preparations were for lethality. Where old, useless 5-inch casemate guns had been, teams were now installing circular armored tubs. Into these tubs, they mounted the Oerlikon 20 mm, placing them on any flat surface that could bear the weight. And then came the Bofors. The quad 40 mm mounts were lowered by crane, massive, complex, and deadly. They were connected to their own dedicated gun directors. The ship was a porcupine, bristling with guns on every level. An inspector's report from Battleships dated April 1943 captured the transformation with cold, technical precision. Subject: BB-36 reconstruction. The addition of 10 quad 40 mm mounts, 48 20 mm mounts, and 8 twin 5-inch 38 cal mounts has increased the ship's anti-aircraft throw weight by an estimated 1/200%. Stability calculations are within acceptable limits due to hull blister augmentation. The vessel is no longer a standard type battleship. She is a new class of fire support ship. The secret test was not a trial. It was combat. She was refloated, and after brief sea trials, she sailed not for the Pacific, but for the Atlantic. Her first test would be the coast of France. The first test of the reborn Nevada was D-Day, June 6, 1944. She was the bombardment flagship for the landings at Utah Beach. The Luftwaffe was largely absent, but this test was about her other new role: fire support. For days, her 14-inch guns, now guided by new radar and air spotters, methodically dismantled German coastal batteries. She fired so many rounds that her gun barrels were completely worn out. This was the first success. She proved her value. She steamed back to the U.S., had her guns relined, and finally sailed for the Pacific. The real test, the one she was built for, was coming. In February 1945, she was off Iwo Jima. And in March 1945, she arrived at the last battle, Okinawa. This was the hell the Nevada was designed for. The Japanese, in their desperation, unleashed the Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemum, the kamikaze. On April 6, 1945, the alarm blared, air raid warning, condition red. The sky was full. The fleet's Combat Air Patrol, KP, was overwhelmed. A Zeke fighter carrying a 500 lb bomb broke through. It dived straight for the Nevada. This was the moment. The CIC screamed coordinates. The 5-inch 38s erupted, their new proximity-fused, VT-fused shells creating a black wall of flak. The Bofors 40 mm quads opened up, their MK-37 directors tracking the plane automatically, the red tracers a solid line. The 20 mm Oerlikons joined in. The Nevada became a volcano of high explosives. The plane was flown apart. It was shredded by the volume of fire. But its momentum was unstoppable. The wreckage, and its bomb, smashed into the Nevada's main deck. The bomb exploded. It killed 11 sailors and wounded 49. It destroyed two 20mm mounts and a quad Bofors mount. At Pearl Harbor, this hit would have been catastrophic. Here, it was a flesh wound. The new thicker deck armor held. The damage control teams had the fires out in 20 minutes, and the Bofors mounts next to the crash kept firing. The fortress had been hit, it had bled, but its shield had held. This was the breakthrough. If stories like this fascinate you, stay with us. The next chapter of wartime innovation might surprise you. The confrontation that validated the floating fortress was not a single meeting, but a cultural war fought in the meeting rooms of the Naval War College throughout 1943. On one side were the carrier admirals, men like Mark Mitcher, who believed the battleship was a slow, fuel-guzzling liability. Gentlemen, one might have argued, the battleship is dead. Prince of Wales proved it. They are magnets for torpedoes. Every officer we assign to a BB is one we don't have for a carrier or a destroyer. On the other side were the old battleship admirals, who still dreamed of a line of battle engagement with the Yamato. But there was a third voice. The engineers from boo ships and the pragmatists from the amphibious forces. Their defense was not about glory. It was about utility. You are both wrong, a boo ship's captain, our composite hero, would state. The standard battleship's role is no longer ship-to-ship combat. Its primary role is survival and fire support. We are not rebuilding the Nevada to fight the Yamato. We are rebuilding her to survive the 500 planes protecting Yamato so she can get close enough to bombard an enemy beach. The defense was passionate, but it was based on data. The new 5-inch 38, coupled with the Mk-37 director and the VT fuse, is the most effective anti-aircraft system in the world. The Bofors 40mm is the most effective medium-range killer. By blistering the hull, we sacrifice speed, yes, but we gain stability. We gain a platform that can mount 100 anti-aircraft guns. The Marines cannot take an island without fire support. The carriers cannot survive without an AA screen. This, he would conclude, gesturing to the Nevada's plans, is the bodyguard. It is the shield. The confrontation was won not with words, but by the performance of the ships themselves. The true final test was Operation Iceberg, Okinawa. The battle, which began in April 1945, was not a single engagement. It was a 30-day siege. The U.S. fleet was anchored, providing support for the invasion. They could not maneuver. They were static targets, just as they had been at Pearl Harbor. But they were not the same targets. We are on the deck of the USS West Virginia, BB-48. Weavy, another Pearl Harbor survivor, rebuilt identically to the Nevada. The call comes, flash red. A spotter plane radios, tally-ho, 200 bandits, Angels 20, heading south. The fleet's cap intercepts, and the sky becomes a maelstrom of dogfights. But dozens get through. The West Virginia's new radar paints the targets. Her CIC is a cool, dark bubble of calm. Target designated bearing 090, range 10, 000 yards, designate Cherry 1. The 5-inch 38s fire as one. A valve disintegrates in a black puff of VT-fused flak. Splash 1. But there are more. Cherry 2, 3, 4, 5. The 40mm Bofors take over. The sound is a constant deafening whump, whump, whump. A Betty bomber tries to fly through the wall of steel. Its wing is cut off. It cartwheels into the sea. A Zeke, damaged, wobbles through the flak. It's too close for the 40s. The 20mm Oerlikons open up. The sound is a rip, like canvas tearing. The plane is hit, on fire, but the pilot is dead, and the plane is still coming. It strikes the West Virginia's superstructure. A glancing blow, fire, shrapnel, but the armor holds. The damage control teams are on it before the smoke clears. During the Okinawa campaign, kamikazes sank 36 U.S. ships and damaged 368 more. But no American battleship was sunk. The Missouri, Nevada, Tennessee, and Maryland were all hit, and they all survived. They all kept firing. The fortress concept was validated in blood and fire. The war ended. The Missouri, an Iowa class but armed with the same AA doctrine, hosted the surrender. The AA refit program was a total, unqualified success. Post-war analysis by Buord was clear. The Bofors 40mm and the VT-fused 5-inch 38 were the most effective anti-aircraft weapons of the war. A 1946 report estimated that the 40mm Bofors was responsible for approximately 30 to 40% of all Japanese aircraft shot down by the U.S. Navy in the last year of the war. The Nevada's final statistics were staggering. In 1941, she had a handful of 50-caliber guns. By 1945, she carried 10 quad 40mm guns, 40 barrels, 48 20mm guns, and 16 5-inch 38 guns. Her ability to throw high explosive shells into the sky had increased by over 200%. This was the legacy. The battleship's role was changed forever. It was no longer the queen of the seas, but it had become the fleet's anchor, its final unbreakable shield. The long-term effect was the birth of the modern naval combat system. The AA gun was eventually replaced by the Standard missile. The CIC evolved into the Aegis combat system. But the idea of the ship as an integrated system of systems, designed to detect, track, and destroy air threats, was born in the fires of Okinawa and on the rebuilt decks of the Nevada. And what of the hero ship? The Nevada was old. She had been through 2 world wars. She had been sunk, rebuilt, hit by kamikazes, and pounded German fortresses. She was obsolete. After the war, she was assigned as a target for the Operation Crossroads atomic bomb tests. She was 2 Suorun yards from the Baker underwater blast. She was battered, radioactive, and scorched, but she was still floating. The Navy, impressed and frustrated, towed her back to Hawaii. In 1948, they used her for gunnery practice. It took an aerial torpedo and hours of shelling from other ships to finally sink her. She was a floating fortress to the very end. The story of the Nevada's resurrection is not just naval history. It is a universal lesson in adaptation. It is the same engineering challenge faced by NASA engineers shielding a capsule for re-entry, or by modern data scientists building a firewall. The principle is the same: how to make a complex system survive an environment that is actively and intelligently trying to destroy it. The hero of this story was not an admiral. The hero was the bureaucratic, unglamorous, iterative process of learning. It was the anonymous engineer at Buord reverse engineering a Swedish gun. It was the shipyard welder working a 12-hour shift. It was the Bu ship's captain who read a damage report from the Hornet and acted. The fortress was not built by a king. It was built by a committee of thousands. The battleships that survived Pearl Harbor were, in the end, more valuable than those that were destroyed. The Arizona became a tomb. The Nevada became a lesson. She was forced to change, and in doing so, she became the shield for the very different war she was called to fight. The sleek dreadnought of 1941 was a peacetime dream. The ugly, wide, slow ship that emerged from Puget Sound in 1943 was a wartime reality. The sailor on the deck in 1941, helpless with his 50-caliber gun, was replaced by a sailor in 1945, sitting in the armored tub of a 40mm Bofors, part of a symphony of destruction directed by radar. The battleships became fortresses not through their original design, but through their adaptability. They were strong not because they were perfect, but because they were improved. They were monuments to the idea that survival is not a static quality, but an act of constant, painful, and necessary evolution. Every great idea begins as an act of defiance against impossibility. What impossible ideas do you think could change the world?